Okay, so today we're going to be talking about The Waves by Virginia Woolf, published in 1931. I mentioned this book recently in a reading vlog, and I really enjoyed it, and I only got to mention it a little bit there, so I wanted to dedicate a full review to this book because I just thought it was fantastic, and it's definitely worth digging a bit deeper into. It's definitely one of the best things that I've read this year, and certainly for me at least, it's one of Virginia Woolf's best books as well. Part 1, Summary. The Waves is an experimental novel told from the perspectives of 6 characters in the form of 6 interwoven soliloquies. The story follows them from their early childhood right up until old age. Interspersed with their stories is a natural scene of the waves breaking upon the cliffs and shores throughout the course of a single day. Each of the 6 characters has a unique personality and perspective, and Woolf herself wrote that they are not necessarily characters, but different facets of consciousness. There is Bernard, an aspiring storyteller who is obsessed with language and its limitations. Louis, a working-class outsider who aspires to be a great poet, but turns away from it to seek success in business. Neville, who is the most successful in his artistic ambitions, and spends his life in extreme devotion to art and a series of men. Then we have Ginny, a socialite who lives for the present moment and relishes in her body, beauty, and ability to attract men. Susan, a woman who flees from the city to live in the country and commit herself to nature. And lastly, there is Rhoda, reclusive and riddled with anxiety and depression. She often flees from others and stays lost in her own thoughts. Part 2. Woolf's most experimental, but also easiest text. So I wasn't really a big fan of Virginia Woolf when I first read Mrs. Dalloway many years ago, and it was only after trying to read To the Lighthouse 3 times that book really clicked, and then it was only a few months ago when I reread To the Lighthouse that I decided to actually dig deeper into Woolf's work. And that was when I came across The Waves. I think the reason why I struggled with Mrs. Dalloway and to a large extent To the Lighthouse is because of the stream of consciousness type of narration that Woolf uses. And surprisingly, even though The Waves uses that style of narration, I found this book a lot easier to engage with and follow and understand than I did with those 2 other books. This is especially surprising because I actually listened to this book rather than reading it, and I find that stream of consciousness in general is a lot harder to listen to on an audiobook because it requires a lot more attention than you can really give to something when you're listening to it. Now, the reason that maybe I found this a bit easier this time was because I have read a few books now that have this style of writing, so maybe I'm just more used to it, so I don't find it as challenging as I used to. But I also think that there are some things in To the Lighthouse that make the book a lot easier to follow, even if it's still quite an experimental book. In previous books, when Woolf wanted to shift perspective from character to character, sometimes she doesn't really make that apparent. In fact, there are some cases, I think, in To the Lighthouse where you'll have one sentence beginning from the perspective of one character, and then by the end of the sentence you're with a different character. And so those books can be really jarring. But with The Waves, for the most part anyway, Woolf always signifies which character's mind you're in by telling you. So it's a lot easier to follow in this case, because you're always being told who is thinking and when. So whether it's because I'm used to it, or because the story is told in a slightly simpler way, I did find this one a lot easier to read. And that's not to say that it's not one of her most experimental books, because it definitely is. Not only do you have a book that's told through monologues, but these monologues combine direct action with dialogue and the characters' inner thoughts in ways which it's sometimes really hard to work out which one of these 3 you're listening to. And then of course we also have the framing narrative of the waves crashing upon the shores throughout the day, and the time of day that it is reflecting the time of life that the characters are at. So there's still a lot of very complex and interesting things going on, but I think that the way the experimentation works in this book doesn't make the book more difficult to read, because it seems to me that the experimentation is mainly in the structure of the story, and even though there is obviously experimentation in the prose, the way that Woolf structures it doesn't make it all that difficult to read. So don't be put off by the fact that this is one of Woolf's more experimental books, because it might be experimental, but it's also quite easy and accessible to read at least. At least from my perspective, I struggled a lot with Mrs. Dalloway, I struggled quite a lot with To the Lighthouse, but I managed to read this, reasonably without any kind of difficulties. So I definitely recommend it, and I would also say that it's one of Woolf's most underrated books as well. Part 2. The Cycle of Life. So there are some books where you have to reread them because the plot is so complex and there's so much going on that you want to reread it to work out what the plot is. You've got other books that maybe have characters that are just so rich and in depth that you need to read the book again and again just to understand them. And then you have books where it's not so much the characters or the plot, but it's the sort of book where you need to reread it at different stages in your own life, because when you reread it at a different stage of life, you'll come up with a completely new interpretation of the book and you relate to it in a very different way. And for me, The Waves definitely fits into that third category of book. It's a book that I think I'll be rereading again and again, especially as time goes by. Now, the book is divided into 9 parts. The first one deals with childhood, the second one we go to adolescence, the third one goes to young adulthood, so like early to mid-20s, and the fourth part is somewhere in between late 20s and early 30s, so early middle age, and it's where the characters all come together, have this dinner party, and they kind of reflect on each other, their stages of lives, and how their relationships have changed over time. At this point in the story, a lot of the characters have been away from each other, and the only reason that they're going to this dinner together is because they all have a mutual friend called Percival who is leaving England for India. So they all come together to say goodbye to him. I found this scene especially poignant, and it's one of the best scenes in the book. Also, as someone who's around the similar stage of life that the characters are in at this moment of the book, I just found that it connected with me on many levels. At this point, the characters have become less idealistic than they were when they were kids, and they're starting to think a lot more about aging, about how things are going to go forward in the future. This middle part of the book, dealing with the characters at this stage, was definitely the bit that I related to the most as someone who is going through that stage of life at the moment. But what's interesting about the book, I imagine, is that as you get older, as you move through these various life stages, you'll probably find that you connect to different parts of the book. And that's definitely something that I'd like to hear your thoughts on in the comments if you've read The Waves. Which part of the book do you find that you relate to the most? One thing that becomes a lot more constant as the characters get older, though, is this increasing anxiety about death and mortality. And this begins when their friend Percival, who they last saw at the dinner party, dies, and they have to confront mortality for the first time. Now, all of the characters deal with their anxieties about death in very different ways from each other, and all of them, with the exception of Rhoda, who we will talk about later, manage to come up with a way of dealing with those anxieties. Bernard tries to bring order to his life through language. Louis tries to bring order to his life by having a successful career as a businessman. Neville devotes himself to art. Susan devotes herself to nature and motherhood, and Ginny devotes herself to the physical world and hedonism. Now, all of these various things that the characters do are in response to this anxiety that they feel about death. It's their way of dealing with the kind of existential dread that constantly returns to them throughout the course of the story. Now, Rhoda stands out as someone who has the opposite reaction to this anxiety about death. Rather than coming up with some way of dealing with her anxieties, she embraces death and actually commits suicide at some point in the story. I really like this theme because it's something that I can relate to myself as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about death and being kind of anxious about it. And so what I liked about the story is not only do you have that theme, but also the fact that you have 6 characters who all have slightly different responses to this anxiety about death and aging and the cycle of life and all that stuff. And so as an individual who's preoccupied with that, it just gives you more to think about when you're reading these different responses to it. Because Woolf has 6 characters dealing with this problem, and these 6 characters are all very different in their personalities, you just have a lot more richness and a lot more to explore in relation to this theme. Another thing that I really like that's connected with this broader theme of the cycle of life is the way that the characters become more nostalgic as well as they get older. Once all the dreams have kind of, worn off a bit and they've lived in the real world for a long time, and everything seems a little bit duller to them, and they start thinking back to their childhood and their adolescence and how they've changed over time. Again, this is something that I can relate to because I'm becoming more and more like that as I'm getting older and becoming more and more anxious about the future. So I think for me it just captured really well the stage of life in which I'm at, but I also think that because you follow these characters throughout most of their lives, it's something that anyone of any age can read and still find something slightly different that they can connect to. So if you're interested in books about aging, about mortality, and how people change over time, I definitely recommend this because it's one of the best books I've ever read that deals with these themes. Part 3. Individual and collective identities. Another big theme in The Waves is identity, and to some extent this theme is also connected to the theme of mortality, because the characters basically construct their identities and who they are as a way of dealing with their fears about mortality. So these two things are connected, but they're also a little bit different as well. The ultimate question with respect to identity in this story is what actually is an identity? Is your identity something that's stable and individual and just related to you, or is it something more open and fluid than that? And different characters in the story represent different kind of ideas about what identity is and how it works. But at the kind of two extremes, I guess, you could say, you have Bernard and you have Rhoda. Bernard is a character who reflects on identity quite a lot because he's kind of interested in the limitations of language and how we communicate with each other. And so the theme of identity also is a part of that. Throughout the story, Bernard often notes how his identity is vastly dependent on the people who are around him. And at some points he might think of himself as being one of the other characters if he's acting in a certain way or doing something in a certain way. And so Bernard represents someone whose identity is quite fluid and open. He doesn't see himself as sealed off inside an individual body, at least not all the time, and because there are some cases where he feels like his identity becomes extended. And this is something that happens as well in the story itself, when the 6 characters come together for the dinner party, and when they come together again for the final time later on in the story, there's a brief moment in which their identities start to mingle with each other and everything becomes a little bit confused. Rhoda is basically the opposite to Bernard in this respect. She's someone who is very closed off from others and who would rather be completely concealed from others. She wants to protect her identity from invasion by others, and you see this in the way that she acts. She's always retreating from relationships, whether those are friendships or even romance. She's always pulling herself away, and she's always trapped within her own internal identity. And sadly for Rhoda, this doesn't seem to lead to a very good place because she is the character that kills herself. It seems to me that what Woolf might be suggesting here is that you can't successfully close yourself off in that way, or at least if you try to do it, you're going to be quite miserable because there are always things trying to encroach on you and your sense of self. People around you, friends, family members, even just nature itself is always going to be there to, make you react a certain way to something. And, you can't just protect your identity in a little box inside your head. You are part of the world, and to be part of the world, you have to engage with it. But Rhoda really doesn't want to do that. She just wants to stay in her head. Contrast this with Bernard, who, rather than dying in the final part of the story, actually narrates the entire last part of the story by himself. This is the only chapter in the book where we just get one perspective, and it makes sense that it would be Bernard's. Because Bernard's whole thing is about expanding one's identity, and because he sees himself sometimes as kind of including these various other characters within himself, it makes sense that he would be the one to tie the story together. Although using the term tie the story together is a bit of a misnomer, because actually Bernard doesn't tie the story together. He actually recognizes that you can't necessarily do that because this is just, a string of random events that are from someone's lives. So instead, he just notes the things that he finds interesting about these lives or significant, and then leaves it to the reader to put together and find meaning and significance in the story that's being told. Part 4. Characters, Motifs and Prose. So at the centre of the story, obviously we do have these 6 characters. And basically, because there's no real plot to speak of, the thing that this story falls on to a big part is the characters themselves. Although I would say that Woolf's sort of over-intellectual sometimes style of writing can make characters not stand out as much as they could, especially when they're children. Writing them in this kind of intellectual way sometimes doesn't jar well with me, at least. But in general, that doesn't get in the way of her creating some wonderful, nuanced, 3-dimensional characters. The first thing that I enjoy about them is that they are all, I would say, pretty realistic depictions of real human people. Every single character has some kind of triggering anxiety, some kind of, fundamental thing that bothers them, and that seems to bother them throughout their entire lives. They all have flaws in terms of their morality, they all have strengths. None of them are particularly perfect, but they're also not terrible people either. They're just regular people, which is really nice, because I think, sometimes people can go too far in making people out to be horrible when they want to create complex characters. And obviously sometimes people just want to make morally good hero type characters. But here we just have regular characters with regular issues dealing with regular things, for the most part, even if, some of them are a little bit intellectual types. And a more specific thing that Woolf does that I really like is she uses little motifs as ways to kind of signal characters. And now sometimes these are just like motifs in the sense that a character just keeps thinking about something. For example, Louis always thinks about his Australian accent, and it's something that really bugs him that he has this accent, because obviously he was brought up in England, and so he feels kind of insecure about it. Then you have Ginny, who does this gesture where she raises her arm, and this is usually in summons to a man that she's attracted, and this gesture to her kind of signifies her ability to get men basically at will because she's so attractive. Then you have more general things like imagery being used to reflect certain characters. For example, with Susan, you get this recurring motif of leaves and things growing and vegetation, which obviously symbolizes her connection to nature and wanting to be a mother, not just of her children, but also of the land on the farm that she ends up working on. And then we have Rhoda, who is usually symbolized through water, which It's implied, but not revealed how she dies, but it's implied that she might have drowned herself. So the symbol of water there makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense for her because as a character, she sort of just wants to get lost in emptiness. She just wants to be swept away. And, water of the ocean is quite good at doing that, so using water as a symbol for that is really effective. All of these motifs do a great job of just showing how the characters are distinct from each other, not just in their personalities, but also in terms of the things that they're supposed to represent as well. It's also definitely worth going back and reading the book once you're kind of aware of these motifs, just to see how they appear and where they appear, and obviously to think about what they might mean. But of course, it's not just the motifs and the little quirks that make these characters so fascinating. What makes them fascinating is just that they're very well written characters who have deep issues that they explore in their own heads and work out together, and it's just a joy to kind of, well, I don't know if it's quite a joy, but it's nicely melancholic to read this story and see them progress through their lives. Part 5, Conclusion. So overall, I think The Waves is a fantastic book, and I would definitely recommend it to you. It explores these themes of mortality and nostalgia through the lives of these 6 characters who are all responding to these things in different ways. Because it's a story that covers people's whole lives, and it's 6 people, not just one, I think that there is just something to recommend it to almost anyone, regardless of who you are, regardless of the stage of life that you're at. It's also quite interesting philosophically, touching on these questions about identity and what is a person, and where does one individual begin and another end, and it's done really well as well, and also doesn't give any clear-cut answers either, which is always nice in a novel. And lastly, we have 6 fantastic characters who are all really interesting, engaging, and who are definitely worth rereading the book just to try and understand them even more. Honestly, I could probably give a section on each of these characters, but I'm not going to do that because this video is already quite long. But perhaps maybe in the future, when I get round to doing another reader's guide, I might do The Waves, because I just think it's a fantastic book and one that I will definitely be returning to again and again and again. Alright, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for updates for new videos. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of The Waves. If you've read it, do you think that it is one of Woolf's more underrated books, or do you not like it so much? Either way, let me know what you think. But that's it for this video, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!